She told me that I was the source of all the drama, that my life was just a continuous toxic spiral, and the words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't just the language, the vicious, ugly curse words that rained down. It was the surgical precision of the accusations. She didn't just tell me I was difficult. She framed my entire existence as an inconvenience to everyone she loved. I sat in the quiet of my own living room, the phone screen glowing with her final message, and I struggled to breathe. I kept rereading it, trying to find the crack in the glass, the moment where the truth might slip out. But it was a wall of venom. She painted a picture of me that had nothing to do with who I actually was. She claimed that my life was a series of emotional, hard times, and that I was the one who continually manufactured the chaos. I remember how much I had wanted her to understand. I had given her my time, my energy, my very physical presence for 2 agonizing weeks. We had shown up, ready to help her settle into the bewildering, beautiful chaos of having 2 babies. I was exhausted, my own life hanging in the delicate balance of job stress and the fragile, unpredictable journey toward starting our own family. Yet all of that effort, all of that visible sacrifice, was apparently just a temporary inconvenience to her perfect, pristine life. And the hardest part, the part that kept playing on a loop in my mind, was the sudden, devastating shift in her tone. She had started with the "we need to leave for the good of everyone" line, making it sound like a selfless sacrifice. But then the message pivoted, shifting from concern for my well-being to a brutal, highly personalized takedown of my character. It was in that vicious spiral of accusation that I found the subtle contradiction, the single thread that didn't match the narrative she was weaving. She accused me of making everything about myself, of being selfish, of only bringing my own pain into her life. But if she was so concerned with the integrity of our family, the sanctity of the home, the emotional harmony, if she truly believed I was the poison, then why was she so quick to share the raw, messy details of my recent struggles? Why did she feel the need to detail the emotional weight of my wife and me trying to conceive, the history of my own difficult times, the private ache of my own heart? Why give away such deeply personal ammunition, unless she needed me to understand that the story she was telling was only half the truth? I spent hours staring at that phone, the sheer magnitude of her bitterness hanging in the air. I knew I had to go dark. I needed distance, needed silence, needed to figure out who I was arguing with, my sister, or the impossible, exhausting version of her expectations. What was the real cost of trying to keep up with her perfect narrative? I spent those hours staring at the phone, the sheer magnitude of her bitterness hanging in the air like a suffocating blanket. Every single word felt meticulously chosen, weighted, designed not just to hurt, but to dismantle. It wasn't just an attack on my behavior. It was an excavation of my entire history, a brutal cataloging of my perceived flaws. She didn't just tell me I was dramatic. She recited the exact cadence of my deepest fears, the vulnerability of my marriage, the exhaustion of the years we spent waiting for that first baby, and the quiet, grinding grief of my own struggles. It was a performance of martyrdom, painted with the colors of deep, profound disappointment. I reread the message until the screen blurred, searching for the pivot point, the single misplaced comma, the telltale sign that this was merely venting, but it wasn't. It was a carefully constructed narrative, one that positioned her as the eternal victim and me as the perpetual source of chaos. I realized then that the cruelty wasn't the goal. The goal was control. The goal was to make me feel so exposed, so guilty, that I would retract my boundaries, that I would apologize for needing space, for needing my own emotional life. I tried to rewind the tape to the moments before the final text. I thought about the first week. The veneer of help was so thick, so perfect, that I had almost forgotten how brittle it was. We were there to give comfort, to be the rock, but she had turned us into the scaffolding, something disposable and necessary only until she could perfect her own facade of motherhood and perfect domesticity. I remembered the afternoon when my wife was struggling with the baby, the sheer, raw exhaustion etched into her face. She had tried to pull me away, to tell me we needed to leave, that the air in that house felt too heavy to breathe. I had been arguing with my sister, arguing with the perfect narrative she kept weaving, and I hadn't seen the subtle tremor in her hands, the way her eyes kept drifting to the kitchen window, like she was watching something that wasn't there. It was the way she spoke about my history. Too, the details were unnerving. She spoke about my father's illness, about the job loss, about the times I felt like I was failing. She knew these details. Yes, but she framed them not as hardship, but as proof that I was inherently unstable, a constant source of drama. I sat there, surrounded by the silence of our rental car, the weight of her accusations pressing down on my chest. I felt a profound, sickening realization. She didn't just know my past. She had been watching it, curating it, gathering it up like precious, poisonous souvenirs. I thought about the fact that she had been so quick to dismiss my need for boundaries, so adept at making me feel like the ingrate, the one who always takes. But if she truly believed that I was the poison, the source of all the drama, why was she so desperate to share the deep, messy, vulnerable truth of my heart? Why give away such deeply personal ammunition, unless she needed me to understand that the story she was telling was only half the truth? I needed to step away, to let the dust settle, to figure out who I was arguing with. Was it my sister, or the impossible, exhausting version of her expectations. The silence became my only defense. A wall built brick by painful brick. I knew I had to go dark. But as I finally let my phone drop into my lap, a single, unsettling thought surfaced. A thought that pulled me back to the moment we arrived to the pristine, silent house, and to the way she looked at us, not with gratitude, but with a cold. I needed to step away, to let the dust settle, to figure out who I was arguing with. Was it my sister, or the impossible, exhausting version of her expectations? The silence became my only defense. A wall built brick by painful brick. I knew I had to go dark. But as I finally let my phone drop into my lap, a single, unsettling thought surfaced. A thought that pulled me back to the moment we arrived to the pristine, silent house, and to the way she looked at us, not with gratitude, but with a cold assessment. I started counting backward, not the days since the fight, but the days since we moved in. I wanted to find the moment the shine wore off, the instant the golden glow of family support faded into something brittle and sharp. We had always been close. My sister and I, we grew up sharing everything, secrets, clothes, scraped knees. Our bond was the kind you write songs about. I genuinely believed that no matter how complicated life got, no matter how much distance the baby chaos put between us, she would always be my safe harbor. That's why the betrayal felt so absolute, so physically painful, like a deep cut that never stopped. Bleeding. Looking back, I romanticize the early days. The first week felt like a bubble. Everything was manageable. The house smelled like lemon polish and possibility. We laughed over dinner, the kind of deep, unrestrained laughter that makes your ribs ache afterward. We were a unit, a small, temporary family unit, built on the flimsy foundation of shared exhaustion and mutual affection. It was those early days I clung to, the ones where I convinced myself that she was just stressed, that the complaints about the fridge, the chores, the groceries, it was just the acute, hormonal chaos of new parenthood wearing her down. I dismissed it as typical sisterly martyrdom. I remember one afternoon, the sun streaming through the bay window, and she caught me watching her interact with our daughter Lily. She just smiled, a genuine, soft smile, and told me, "You're doing great, just keep being you." It was so effortless, so reassuring. I saved that memory like a shield against the current storm. And then the subtle shifts started. They were like tiny, almost imperceptible slips of glass in a perfect pane of window. Nothing alarming on its own, but enough to make you pause and wonder. I remember noticing how she always seemed to be watching me when I spoke to my wife, not with interest, but with a kind of meticulous observation, like she was taking notes on my every word, cataloging my reactions. And those comments about Lily, the daughter, who was sweet, but also deeply attached to her mother, were particularly unsettling. She would correct my wife's tone when we were playing, not suggesting a better way, but correcting a flaw. It felt like we were performing in a space where only she held the script. I started noticing other things, too, like the way she would frequently ask me, "Did you remember to call mother-in-law today?" Even when I had already said I had handled it. Small reminders, constant nudges, making sure I was aware of the expectations, the invisible checklist that kept the family machine running smoothly. I truly believed that because she was my sister, because we shared that history, I was immune to this kind of emotional erosion. I thought that history was enough to cushion. I started noticing other things, too, like the way she would frequently ask me, "Did you remember to call your mother-in-law today?" Even when I had already said I had handled it. These were small reminders, constant nudges, making sure I was aware of the expectations, the invisible checklist that kept the family machine running smoothly. It was like I was perpetually operating under spotlight, and she was the one holding the beam, making sure I didn't forget a single tiny detail. I truly believed that because she was my sister, because we shared that history, I was immune to this kind of emotional erosion. I thought that history was enough to cushion the blows, that the blood connection would always outweigh the sheer weight of her constant critique. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the cracks started to appear. It wasn't just the chore reminders or the critiques of my wife's parenting style. It was the silences, the way she would watch us, especially when we were talking to each other, a knowing, almost predatory look in her eyes, like she was taking notes on my every word, cataloging my reactions, assessing my weakest points. And those comments about Lily, the daughter, who was sweet, but also deeply attached to her mother, were particularly unsettling. She would correct my wife's tone when we were playing, not suggesting a better way, but correcting a flaw. It wasn't helpful guidance. It was a statement of ownership. It felt like we were performing in a space where only she held the script, and we were merely extras in her perfectly curated family drama. I started digging into the background details of the house too. I found a few things that just didn't align. The schedule for the household staff seemed to be inconsistent, and I noticed that the little side bedroom, the one that was always kept closed, was somehow spotless, almost too clean. It didn't look like it had been used in ages, yet she acted as if it were crucial to the daily routine. And then there were the conversations that happened when I thought I was alone with her. They were always framed as concern, but they felt like interrogations. She would ask me about my work stress, asking leading questions that subtly made me feel guilty about my own exhaustion, painting a picture that implied my stress was somehow interfering with the family's harmony. One afternoon, while we were out grocery shopping, she stopped me in the aisle and asked about something completely unrelated to the kids or the chores. She asked about my college days, specifically about a friend I had from years ago. I hadn't seen that friend in over a decade. She didn't ask who the friend was. She just watched my face when I started to speak, and there was a flicker of something in her expression, not recognition, but something that looked terribly, suspiciously like fear. It made me pause. Why was she so interested in that? What did that friend have to do with them, or with the state of her perfect little family life? I found myself genuinely unsettled by those moments, those little gaps in the narrative, the moments when the control slipped and something else peeked through. It made me question everything. Was she genuinely trying to help, or was she trying to maintain a fragile, constructed image of perfect family life? And we were just the inconvenient smudge on the glass. I keep wondering what secrets are hidden behind that immaculate veneer. What stories are being carefully suppressed in the walls of that house? What do you think she really knows about me or about my wife? I need your theories on this. It makes you realize that sometimes the things you should have checked, the things you should have investigated, were right there in plain sight, waiting for you to look closer. I found myself genuinely unsettled by those moments, those little gaps in the narrative, the moments when the control slipped and something else peeked through. It made me question everything. Was she genuinely trying to help, or was she trying to maintain a fragile, constructed image of perfect family life? And we were just the inconvenient smudge on the glass. I keep wondering what secrets are hidden behind that immaculate veneer. What stories are being carefully suppressed in the walls of that house? It wasn't just the criticism of our cleanliness or our cooking. It was the way she spoke about us when I thought she was out of earshot. It was the sudden, strained politeness that felt brittle, like a curtain about to tear. We started noticing patterns, a slight change in her tone if we stayed up too late, a sudden, intense focus on the little girl, a scrutiny that felt less like maternal bonding and more like an assessment. It was as if every interaction was being logged, every flaw noted down for later consumption. I remember one afternoon when I was helping the child build a tower with wooden blocks, and she walked past, stopping just enough for me to feel her gaze. She didn't say anything, but the air thickened, becoming heavy and charged with an invisible judgment. It felt like she was watching me perform, ensuring I understood that I was perpetually failing the test of being a good, selfless visitor. The conversations started becoming minefield walks. We would discuss things that had nothing to do with us, details about their past, or the history of the house. She would drop names, mention acquaintances, people who had lived there before, and each name felt weighted with unspoken expectations. I started catching her in the middle of deleted messages on her phone, snippets of conversation that were scrubbed away. Moments later, leaving me with a nagging feeling that I had glimpsed something she desperately wanted to keep buried. I felt like I was walking through a meticulously arranged museum where everything was beautiful, preserved, and utterly fake. My initial reluctance about the help being required was nothing compared to the creeping sense that I was witnessing a performance. My wife and I were characters in a drama that had already been written, and we didn't know our lines. The tension peaked during one of our quiet evenings. The little girl was asleep, and the house was finally silent. I found myself looking at my wife, seeing the exhaustion etched into her face, and I felt a profound swell of protective love. In that moment, I thought, this is what we came here for. This was supposed to be a respite, but that was not the worst part. The worst part was realizing that the emotional labor wasn't just coming from us. It was coming from her, constantly policing the emotional atmosphere, making sure that every minor deviation from her perfect script was immediately corrected, often through the child, who seemed to take her cues from the emotional undertow of the adults. I started researching her background, just out of curiosity, just to fill in the blanks that were so glaringly apparent. And that's when I found the discrepancy. It was small, almost insignificant. A misplaced date on a community plaque, a different detail about a neighboring property that didn't match the official records. It was a tiny glitch in the perfect picture she had so carefully painted for the world to see. It made me question everything. Was she genuinely trying to help? Or was I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being analyzed. The glitches I found, the dates, the property lines, they felt like tiny cracks in the foundation of the perfect life she presented. I finally cornered her in the kitchen late one evening, when the baby was finally asleep and the house was quiet, the silence itself feeling charged with unspoken accusation. I started carefully, trying to keep my voice level, trying to sound like a concerned relative rather than a detective. Sis, I was doing some research on the neighborhood, on the history of this block, and I found something, a discrepancy. Her smile, which had been a constant, effortless thing since we arrived, faltered for the first time. It didn't disappear, but it stuttered, like a faulty piece of technology. She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms, suddenly radiating an almost brittle defensiveness. What discrepancy? What are you talking about? The plaque outside. The old library, I continued, pointing vaguely in the direction of the window. It mentions the original date of the zoning change, but the official municipal records I cross-referenced online suggest different year. It's just a small detail, but it throws off the entire timeline of the area's development. She laughed. It was a bright, sharp sound that seemed entirely too loud for the quiet kitchen. Oh, you and your little sleuthing hobbies, she dismissed, waving a hand as if brushing away a speck of dust. You really need to stop trying to find flaws in everything, don't you? It's exhausting. Frankly, I flinched at the tone, at the way she made me feel like the one who was unstable. It's not about flaws, though it's about accuracy. If the historical record is wrong, it affects how we understand the community. She walked toward me, her proximity suddenly overwhelming, and she reached out, placing a hand gently on my arm. Her touch felt too soft, too convincing. Listen to me. You are stressing yourself out. You're looking for reasons to be upset, to find something wrong because you feel unsettled. This whole trip, it's supposed to be a restful escape, a time for us to breathe. Why are you digging for problems? Her voice dropped, becoming a low, sympathetic murmur that was far more manipulative than any shout. She looked into my eyes, and in that moment, I felt the weight of her expectation, the invisible net of emotional guilt she was casting over me. I started to falter, my own careful argument dissolving under the weight of her practiced concern. She made me doubt my own sanity, making me question whether my careful observation or her serene narrative was the reality. It's just that sometimes, she whispered, pulling her hand away, her expression softening into profound pity. People get so caught up in details that they forget the big picture, the love, the help, the family. Don't let the need to be right ruin the moment. Okay. I stood there, completely undone, the evidence of the glitch suddenly feeling trivial, insignificant, a pointless battle against her impenetrable facade. I felt the truth draining out of me, replaced by a creeping, unsettling doubt. I nodded slowly, accepting her dismissal, the exhaustion of the fight suddenly too much. But as I turned away, reaching for my coffee cup, I noticed something small and shiny near the edge of the counter, something that hadn't been there before. It was a small, tarnished silver locket, engraved with a single, unfamiliar initial, the letter E. It definitely wasn't hers, and it was the kind of thing that only someone who lived in the neighboring house would drop. I was left standing there, suspended in the wreckage of our conversation, the weight of her accusations settling over me like dust, the venom in those final texts, the implication that my entire existence was a continuous source of drama. It felt physical, like a cold draft piercing through my skin. She had painted a picture of me as inherently flawed, a toxic presence who only arrived when it was convenient for others. The initial wave of pain, the deep, gut-wrenching betrayal, started to soften into something profound, something that felt dangerously close to pity. I realized that we had become so completely caught up in the details, in the petty skirmishes of chores and expectations, that we had entirely forgotten the big picture. We were discussing love, help, and the messy, complicated reality of family. I thought about her, trying to see past the sharp edges of her anger, and I felt a momentary flash of sympathy. People get so caught up in details that they forget the big picture. The love, the help, the family. Don't let the need to be right ruin the moment. Okay, I nodded slowly, accepting her dismissal. The sheer exhaustion of maintaining the defense, the constant need to prove our worth, was suddenly too much. The battle felt pointless, a futile struggle against her impenetrable facade of superiority. I just needed to leave. As I turned away, reaching for the mug of cooling coffee that had been sitting on the counter, my focus was still glued to the feeling of being defeated, of having lost the argument, lost the relationship, lost the peace. But then my eyes caught something near the edge of the butcher block counter. Nestled in the faint line of dust was a small, shiny piece of metal. It was almost invisible against the worn wood, something utterly out of place in the drama that had filled this house for weeks. I bent down, picking it up. It was a tarnished silver locket, delicate and heavy. I turned it over in my palm, running my thumb across the cool metal. It was engraved with a single, unfamiliar initial, the letter E. My heart gave a sharp, jarring thump. This locket did not belong to my sister. The pattern of the initial, the specific style of the engraving, it screamed of someone who lived in the neighboring house, someone who had just been there. Everything I had been processing, the unfair chores, the constant criticism, the exhausting parental leave, suddenly felt trivial, insignificant. It was a pointless battle, and this locket was the first crack in the perfect, suffocating narrative she had constructed around us. I looked up, scanning the kitchen, searching for the owner, but the house was empty. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic cleaner and stale tension. I stood there, the cold metal heavy in my hand, trying to fit this mystery into the chaotic narrative of our recent history. How could something so mundane, so tangible appear here, suggesting a life and a secret that had absolutely nothing to do with the parenting drama or the family boundaries? It was like the truth, which I had been carefully placing into the boxes of family obligation and sacrificial love, was suddenly being shattered by the undeniable weight of a forgotten locket. I looked at my wife. She looked at me. We were standing in the middle of their pristine, suffocating kitchen, holding a piece of evidence that suggested a life far richer and more complicated than the one they had allowed us to witness. But the locket was a distraction. The real pressure was coming from the periphery, from the people who saw us, the ones who lived on the other side of the property line, the ones who considered themselves the reasonable ones. The next morning, my sister's mother cornered me at the community pool. She didn't approach with sympathy. She approached with performance. She started by complimenting the cleanliness of the house, a painfully saccharine gesture that felt more like a reprimand than a compliment. Then she shifted the focus, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial, pitying whisper. She started talking about the neighbors, the ones who saw us arrive, the ones who saw us leaving. She framed it as a problem of perception, telling me that people talk, that they whispered about the stress, about the little disagreements, and that they found us challenging. My stomach dropped. I felt the walls of the house, the boundaries, the careful facade they maintained, suddenly dissolving into gossip. "You know," she murmured, adjusting the collar of her expensive cardigan, "people are so sensitive these days. They just need routine. They need structure. It's just harder when things feel unpredictable." She wasn't talking about the locket or the chores. She was talking about me asterisk. She was subtly suggesting that my presence, my stress, my need for boundaries was the source of the disorder, the disruption. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. I felt my wife subtly reach for my hand, a silent reminder that we were in this together. But I kept my eyes locked on her mother. I had always believed that family was a protective shield, a place where you were unconditionally supported. But watching her perform that pitying conversation, I realized it was more like a spotlight, shining on my perceived failings. Later that week, a mutual friend, someone who had known us since college, called me. She didn't even ask how we were doing. She asked, "Are you okay with the move? Did you and sister's name finally resolve the living situation?" It was the ultimate triangulation. She wasn't asking about my heart, my sanity, or my well-being. She was asking if the asterisk drama had resolved, if the asterisk problem had been fixed so that the social landscape could return to normal. I remember staring at my phone, the blood draining out of my face. I had spent weeks fighting for my right to set boundaries to protect my peace, and the very people who claimed to care for me I had spent weeks fighting for my right to set boundaries to protect my peace, and the very people who claimed to care for me were only interested in the narrative arc of the drama. They cared about the spectacle, not the substance of our lives. The conversation with my friend left me feeling exposed, like I was standing on a stage under a harsh, unforgiving spotlight. I felt depleted. All the emotional energy I had managed to conserve, the little bit of peace I had found in the quiet routine of my own apartment, seemed to evaporate in the wake of her superficial concern. I didn't call her back. I didn't need to. I knew what the rest of the days would bring, a steady, suffocating drip of guilt and passive aggression from my sister. The texts continued, forming a relentless, toxic stream. She never addressed the actual, logistical issues, the $50 I paid in an Uber. She never bothered to mention the sheer volume of groceries I bought to keep our own sanity, the way I was forced to constantly defend my boundaries. No, she only addressed the me asterisk. She painted me as the source of the family's unrest. "You always twist everything," she wrote. You make everything about yourself. It was a masterful piece of psychological warfare. She didn't deny the truth. She simply redefined it, making my pursuit of self-respect sound like a profound personal failing. Then came the final message. It was a wall of accusation, a barrage of words designed not to communicate, but to wound. She told me my life was a carousel of misfortune, that I only brought drama to the people I loved. She used the memory of my parents' difficult time, the grueling hours I put in, even the stress of our failed attempts to conceive, and wrapped it all up in a cruel little bow of pity. She claimed I had never been there for her. It hit me like a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs. Every struggle I had faced, every sacrifice I had made to be there for her. During her first child, her second child, it was all being meticulously erased, replaced by a single, devastating lie. I was numb. I was analyzing the text, searching for the crack in the facade, the moment where the sheer weight of her venom would buckle. I felt my wife gently taking my phone from my hand, sensing the depth of the wound. "It's worse than you think," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You need to see this." She hadn't shown me the message. She had shown me something else. She pointed to a small, velvet-lined box on the coffee table. It was the kind of box you only get when someone is preparing for a life-altering announcement. I hadn't noticed it before. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't pick up the lid. My wife opened it slowly, and inside, nestled against the dark, I couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt thick, charged with unspoken accusations and the metallic tang of disappointment. All the pain from the texts, the feeling of being systematically invalidated, was suddenly mixed with a profound, disorienting curiosity. My wife slowly lifted the lid, and inside, nestled against the dark satin cushion, was not jewelry, nor was it a photograph. It was a single, thick envelope, sealed with a crest I didn't recognize. The crest depicted an oak branch, intertwined with 3 separate thorns. I felt a strange, dizzying lurch in my stomach. It was the kind of physical reaction you have when you realize the floor beneath you is gone. "What is this?" I whispered, the question sounding foreign and weak. My wife didn't answer immediately. She just watched my face, her eyes conveying a mixture of pity and fierce protectiveness. She finally gently slid the envelope out, her fingers brushing against the expensive paper. It was addressed to all of us, to my sister, to her husband, and to me. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was a vacuum, sucking all the oxygen and all the comfortable pretense out of the air. I finally picked up the envelope, my fingers trembling. It felt heavy, weighted with months of secrets. I didn't know who sent it, but the formality of the sealing suggested it wasn't a casual message. My sister finally spoke. her voice surprisingly steady, devoid of its usual sharp edges. Oh, that was from the solicitor. The word solicitor hit me like a physical blow. It immediately reframed everything: the house, the sudden need for help, the perfect timing of the announcement. It wasn't just about childcare. It was about something formal, something legal. What is it about? I asked, keeping my voice level, trying to sound like the man who wasn't reeling. My sister finally leaned forward, her gaze intense, pinning me in place. It's about the trust, the family trust. The world tilted. The family trust. I had always assumed those documents were decades old, untouchable, locked away with the oldest generation. The trust, I repeated, feeling a sudden, cold sweat break out on my neck. Yes, she confirmed, her voice taking on a dramatic resonance. That made me instantly suspicious. It relates to the property, the estate, and certain conditions. My wife subtly placed her hand on my arm, a silent anchor. She hadn't told me anything about a trust. I looked from the envelope to her, searching her eyes for any hint of fear or deceit. But her expression was pure concern, making me doubt my own rising panic. Conditions? I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. My sister smiled then. It was a brittle, triumphant smile that did nothing to reach her eyes. You know how your parents were always so generous, how they always wanted everything to be orderly. Well, the original agreements had clauses regarding the continuation of the family name, the maintenance of the property, and shall we say, the suitability of the next generation. The blood drained from my face. I felt the years of unspoken tension. The family whispers about succession and expectations suddenly materialize into solid, damning parchment. You're saying there are rules. I managed to whisper. Rules, she corrected, her tone dripping with superiority. That must be followed, and those rules, dear brother, require all hands to be on deck. Permanently, she watched my reaction, relishing the confusion etched across my face. She thought she had cornered me. She thought she had the final word, the absolute control. But as I looked down at that seal, at the heavy, ominous paper in my hand, a different kind of thought began to bubble up, a realization that something monumental, something entirely unknown, was about to fall out of the pages. This wasn't just about property. This was about my life, my wife, and the precarious future we had somehow stumbled into, and I had no idea what was waiting for us. The parchment felt impossibly heavy, not because of the material, but because of the weight of every unspoken expectation, every debt, every piece of history that had been casually signed away and deemed irrevocably mine. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the cold, hard reality of the document in my hand. You understand, don't you? She purred, her voice suddenly soft, which was always far more terrifying than her yelling. These are the family rules, the only way to ensure the continuity of everything that matters. I looked at my wife, whose face was a mask of stunned disbelief, and I saw her trying to process the sheer audacity of it. We had been so focused on the petty skirmishes, the chore schedules, the groceries, the way the little girl disliked my wife, that we hadn't seen the viper coiled at the center of it all. The family fortune, the entire structure of their lives, built on invisible threads of obligation. So we are bound by this, I finally whispered, the words tasting like ash. She smiled then, a thin, triumphant curve of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. Bound by what is necessary. Dear brother, it's simply how things have always been. You were always meant to be the steward, the protector, and the rules, as always, apply to everyone. It wasn't just about the property or the money. It was about control. It was about defining who was worthy of belonging and who was disposable. The physical shock of the rules faded, replaced by a deeper, sickening wave of betrayal. Suddenly, I didn't just see the legal clauses. I saw the emotional equivalents, the rules applied to my marriage. Too, they dictated that my wife, the outsider, was inherently deficient. They dictated that my boundaries were merely temporary annoyances that needed to be corrected by the family's superior will. I remembered the subtle jabs, the constant corrections, the way my sister would watch us, not with genuine concern, but with the proprietary air of a curator examining flawed artifacts. She wasn't helping us. She was testing us, grading us, and finding us wanting. And what about our happiness? My wife finally asked, her voice shaking but steady, cutting through the suffocating tension like a knife. My sister laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that scraped against the raw nerves. Happiness, darling. Happiness is what you earn. It's what you maintain. And if you can't maintain it within the parameters of this family, then perhaps you weren't meant to keep it. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Not meant to keep it. We left that day with nothing but the lingering stench of entitlement and the crushing knowledge that the invisible boundaries they had drawn were far more powerful than any legal document. The house felt less like a home and more like a gilded cage, and we were the accidental prisoners who had just realized the locks were controlled by people we once called family. The silence that followed our departure was deafening, filled. The silence that followed our departure was deafening, filled with the phantom echo of everything we had just endured. It wasn't just the quiet of the car ride home, it was the sudden, horrifying absence of the noise, the constant, grating noise of expectation, of judgment, of unspoken demands that had permeated every single moment of those 2 weeks. My wife sat beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. She hadn't spoken since we crossed the threshold of their property line. We didn't need to speak. The message had already been exchanged. the final, brutal epitaph etched across my phone screen. The words she used, words designed not just to hurt, but to dismantle my self-worth, to imply that my entire existence was a burden, a constant source of drama. They were a masterclass in emotional violence. I spent the first hour in a kind of numbness. We drove past neighborhoods, past landmarks, past the life we had built together, and I felt utterly detached. I felt like a ghost, viewing my own life from a great distance. Every single thing my sister had said, every implication that I was selfish, that I only brought toxicity, that I never truly cared, it didn't land as a sharp blow. It landed as a thick, suffocating blanket of truth, or at least a version of truth tailored perfectly to make me feel small. The hardest part was reading the sheer weight of her history. She had woven together anecdotes, moments from years past, citing every perceived failure, every time I had needed support, and twisting it into evidence of my fundamental flawed character. She claimed I never asked for help, that I was always hiding my struggles, and that she was the only constant pillar of support. And I thought, was she right? It was a devastating question, one that forced me to look back at years I had spent trying to maintain a perfect, harmonious family image. Years where I had swallowed my own exhaustion, my own needs, my own genuine feelings of resentment, because the cost of expressing them seemed higher than the cost of silence. I remembered the times I had been struggling, times I hadn't mentioned, times I had simply absorbed, and the ease with which she had dismissed those struggles, framing them instead as signs of my dramatic temperament. It was a pattern, a cyclical pattern of conditional love. We were only welcome when we were useful. We were only valuable when we were solving her problems, managing her household, or worst of all, existing quietly in the background without causing any ripples. When I finally looked at my wife, her eyes were filled with a mixture of sorrow and profound relief. She saw the slow, painful dismantling of my assumptions. She saw the moment the fog lifted, and I understood what the true cost of that help had been. It wasn't the effort, or the groceries, or the endless chores. It was the psychological labor of having to perform for them, of having to be the perfect, compliant, non-challenging guest, lest we risk the withdrawal of their approval. The realization was cold, clinical, and absolutely clarifying. They didn't want help. They wanted affirmation. They needed a steady, reliable resource to reinforce their own sense of normalcy. And I had been the perfect, emotionally available prop in their play. We didn't need their opinion on our marriage. We didn't need their manufactured drama, their exhausting narrative of superior sacrifice. We were finally free of the need to earn our place at the family table, because we had walked away from the table entirely. As we pulled into the quiet, anonymous comfort of our own driveway, I felt a weight lift from my chest that felt centuries old. It wasn't a clean victory, because the wound was too deep, too pervasive, but it was a boundary finally established in blood and tears. It was a radical act of self-preservation. I still don't know what the future holds for that relationship, or if I will ever be able to process the sheer magnitude of that final, cruel message.